What an incredible film, right? It's no surprise that 13th has been nominated for an Oscar for Best Documentary. Many of you have already, should we clap? Many of you have already posed important questions about how we think about these issues, about how we got to where we are, many of which have been answered by the film, about how we think about these going forward, what might make a change. As I introduce the panel, I want to mention one more question to you, which somebody posed as food for thought for really everybody in the room. How do we get more people to see this film? Perhaps during the Q&A after our panel discusses the issues, some of you will have some ideas to share. So I'd like to introduce our panel. I believe they are on their way out. To the sitting, oh, here he is. Is Jelani Cobb, staff writer. Jelani Cobb, Professor Cobb is staff writer for The New Yorker. He's a professor at Columbia Journalism School and is, of course, a featured, wonderful speaker in the film. We have Professor Geraldine Downey. Professor Downey is the director of the Center for Justice at Columbia and a professor of psychology here. We also have Professor Jeff Fagan. Professor Fagan is a national expert on crime and policing. He's a faculty member at Mailman School of Public Health and also my colleague at Columbia Law School. And to moderate, we're also grateful to have with us tonight as our moderator, Michelle Miller. Michelle Miller is an Emmy award-winning correspondent for CBS News, her coverage is wide-ranging. She covered Ferguson, Missouri, following the shooting death of Michael Brown. She has interviewed everyone from Bill Clinton to Beyonce, and we're really quite honored to have her here with us to host the conversation that we're about to embark on. Please learn more about each of our speakers and our moderator online. They all have been doing and continue to do extraordinary things. As I turn this over to Michelle, I want to remind you and really invite you, if you have thoughts and reactions in response to 13th, a few sentences, a personal essay, some questions you want to engage with further after the conversation tonight, please send them to us at universitylife@columbia.edu. We are curating a section on student voices in particular and would really love to have your voices be part of this. So Michelle, let me turn it over to you. And again, thank all of you for joining us, and thanks very much to our panel for being with us this evening.
Thank you. So what did you think? Was it everything you expected, everything you had heard about? This movie has received a lot of positive feedback. Yes? Perfect. Okay. I'm just going to right off the bat just say or ask, what was missing? Anyone?
I can say.
Go ahead.
So I think that the story of women's incarceration was missing. One of the true horrors of the last 40 years is the fact that the United States has become the second highest incarcerator of women in the world, and now has 1/3 of women who are incarcerated in the world. And I think that this is a sort of an untold story of what happened as a result of the war on drugs, that women started to get involved in the criminal justice system in ways that they hadn't before, because of mandatory minimums, because of 3 strikes, and because of the kind of behaviors that were ending up leading people into the criminal justice system. So their story, while there's still just about 7% of people who are in prison, is a story of mothers separated from their children. And when I started to work in prisons first in 1988, that was who I worked with. It was a program to bring kids in to visit their mothers. and the sorrow that they experienced and their children experienced was something that's not told. I would say there's one other thing that I'm going to say that I felt was missing from the film is that I've taught in prisons since '88, and I'm teaching in Sing Sing now, and in the women's facility at Taconic, and we saw prisoners as sort of commodities throughout this film. But they're active, engaged humans, parents, students who have very much a sense of agency and a sense of what they can become given the opportunity. So I didn't feel that came out as much in the film as it could be.
Jeff, Jelani, I know all three of our panelists here know the dangers of mass incarceration, and I'm just curious what the takeaway from this film, and given the context that it really goes in depth over, it takes us all the way back to the very beginning.
Well, one of the things that struck me that was missing, I was going to say women's incarceration, but so second on my list would be the complicity of prosecutors in creating a steady stream of defendants who wind up pleading guilty to charges at a far higher level that carry far higher penalties for African American defendants and Latino defendants compared to what they offer for a plea to white defendants. Now, they all come in the door with the same level of charges that come from, buy and bust operations on the street or a variety of different takedowns. But the charging practices of the prosecutors, the line prosecutors, who actually are following often guidelines that are dictated by the prosecutors' offices, and then they have some wiggle room to deviate from those guidelines. They wind up, and this has been shown empirically in a number of different studies now, in the federal system and also in the state systems, and particularly here in Manhattan. The Manhattan DA is actually quite guilty of this.
The current one?
The current one, Mr. Vance, who opened up his records in an act of somewhat foolishness, I suppose. And when the data analysis were done, it showed that there was a very clear pattern of discrimination. So I think one of the reasons why we see this widening gap racially in prisons, in part can be traced back to the actions of the prosecutors as much as it can to the actions of the police.
Jelani, I'm curious because so much of what I was left with in this film was despair. And did it leave you, the audience, in that way? I was like, where do we go from here? What can we do as journalists, as students, as activists, as citizens? Where do we go?
There are a couple things. First, I think nothing was missing from the film. It was perfect. But if it weren't, I think that one thing that I heard from historian colleagues, which I hadn't realized, it was more of an oversight, was that I think people got the impression that the 13th Amendment was intended to create the carceral state. And there's no indication that that this was a kind of loophole that was quickly exploited by Southern legislatures kind of immediately after.
Was it a loophole, though? Or was it just something left unsaid? Or was it just a...
Well, but this is what I'm saying. Like, when at the end of the, after emancipation, when you were looking at these Southern economies that are wrecked, and in many of these places, there's one county in Georgia where 60% of the capital, the entire county, was human. And so emancipation wiped out 60% of the value in this county, the things that people owned as collateral and so on. And so the kind of sense of using incarceration came out of desperation because people were still trying to figure out how to make cotton work in the Deep South. And people would say, oh, well, we can arrest people and we can still get back to business. But it's not, it was against the interests of the Republican Party at that point to create a carceral state in the South. As a matter of fact, they wanted African Americans to not be incarcerated because they were hoping that blacks would serve as a bulwark against Southern white Democrats. And so it kind of came about through the law of unintended consequences, and that's how we started down this path. But I also think
And the election of 1876.
the election of 1876, the reversal, the kind of the Republican Party is deeply invested in these questions of race for a very narrow window of time. And then by the 1880s, you start seeing things like the Civil Rights Act of 1875 being overturned in 1883, and we see where it goes, like kind of goes downhill quickly. So that's one thing I think from the film that we could talk about. But on the issue of despair, I don't feel that way, actually, because one of the things.
I hate to admit that, but I mean, I was left with a hole.
No, but I understand the sentiment. I understand the sentiment. And one of the things that I think is important is that last year we noted for the first time that incarceration rates fell. And the department, it was Holder or Lynch, that it began to fall under. And people noted that maybe we had reached a point where we could begin to see substantive changes. There was some bipartisan support for reform around these issues. This is before November 8th. And so it looks like a very different world now.
And Jeff Sessions was just confirmed tonight.
Right, and Jeff Sessions was just confirmed this evening. So we don't know what exactly is going to happen under the current regime. But the reason that I don't despair is that I think that, and I always say this to students, is that we can look at the problems, and we teach history from the perspective of problems for very good reasons. But each time we encounter one of these problems, there are people of goodwill and people of conscience who rise to address those concerns. And so if we look at this, we can also say this has been something that's been with us for a long time. In every step of the way, people have fought and they have won some reforms. And those reforms may be tentative or they may be overturned, but there's something to be said about the tradition and legacy of still fighting back.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, let me be a little bit optimistic. So, in the last election, at the same time that we had a bizarre outcome, there were, in a series of counties around the country, successful elections by very strongly reform-minded prosecutors, all of whom, importantly, publicly disavowed the death penalty. These are all in death penalty states, and said, well, I'm not going to do it anymore. And they were elected. And they were elected in places like Harris County in Texas, which is where Houston is, which was for many, many years really the epicenter of capital punishment in the United States. And several other places where there had been very, very active, although dwindling over time, but still active death penalty activity. And the fact that these people could be elected, I think, speaks very much to a kind of innate sense of justice and fairness, at least in parts of the electorate, when they are acutely aware of the inequalities that the system is producing.
So when you discuss inequalities in the system, and when you see this movie, the prism in which we see it is clearly race. It is through the lens of race. And for a lot of people, I mean, do you believe that people, the vast majority of Americans in the mainstream, have accepted that? And with respect to how we have changed, the pendulum has shifted from this notion where people do realize that mass incarceration is just something we just cannot keep pace with, and we're looking at the issue of drugs in particular as more of a public health issue. How does that play out in this new world order in how we're looking at crime and punishment?
So I think that it's very clear to everybody now how many people of color relative to whites who are in prison. When you go into a prison, that's what you see. When you go into a jail, that's what you see. And so I do get the sense from a lot of the work that we do at the center that people across partisan divides think that this is unfair, and that is motivating them to think differently about incarceration.
Not just money? not just as costing states
I
more
really
money?
don't. I don't think that it is. I mean, that is. Because I work with corrections. I work with the prosecutors. I work with the police, as well as get out and about and talk to the general public. I think that there is a sense that this is really unfair.
Really?
And that they want to do something about it. So I'm very optimistic that things can change and that there's examples, like Jeff talked about, of where change is taking place. But it's going to be down at the local level. I'm not sure that Sessions or the Trump administration is going to do very much around criminal justice, either positively or negatively. But there's a lot of efforts, like the Pell Grants that are already in place and an infrastructure that the White House has supported under Obama, that I think it'll take a while to dismantle. I mean, it has legs, and hopefully it'll move forward.
And also there's been reform in the Sentencing Commission in terms of the disparities with crack and powder cocaine, which was one of the other things that happened during the Holder DOJ period. And one other thing I think that's important to kind of recognize is the orange is the new black factor. And I don't mean that simply as the television show, but the television show I think points to a bigger phenomenon in which, you could talk about Piper Kerman, and it's almost a kind of man bites dog kind of story in which there is this, waspy young college student who is caught up and winds up being incarcerated for something she had done, a decade earlier. And this drives home the unfairness of the war on drugs and what we're doing in a way that people would not recognize. Fundamentally, I think they have a difficulty in recognizing the humanity of black and brown people, but they could recognize it in the story of Piper Kerman. And so I think that that's been happening in some other places too, where people are looking at the war on drugs differently now that we have meth and opioid concerns. It's become a very different kind of conversation about it. Now, if I weren't thinking about this idealistically, I would be disillusioned by the stark disparity or the kind of sympathy gap or empathy gap in which people can recognize a white person as being disadvantaged by the system, but not a black or brown person. Were I looking at this pragmatically, I will say if they change laws on the basis of this, black and brown communities will benefit. And so, last thing is that when I was involved in juvenile justice stuff and work to repeal a particularly egregious law in Georgia when I was living there, one of the things that people found was that they passed this draconian law about kind of juvenile offenders, and this legislature was not shocked that they were vacuuming up young black men. But when they started finding the numbers of poor, low-income young white men in rural Georgia counties, they were able to say, oh, wait, no, we have to actually do something about this. Like, we need those people. And that became not the best case scenario, but a scenario that maybe you can tangentially get benefits from.
I want to look at it from this optimistic viewpoint that the three of you all have, because in I think people want to project out into a world of, like, if we got this right, if we did the right things, whatever they may be, what are the benefits of getting the criminal justice system steered on the right course, beyond the fairness quotient, beyond it's the right thing to do and it's justice being served? What are some of the other tangential benefits to society?
Well, we'd save a hell of a lot of money. Even if we didn't have a net cost savings, we'd be redirecting money into more productive places. I think everybody's well aware of the cost of corrections, and I think the state legislatures are in many states. But there's also, unfortunately, there seems to be what economists would call a willingness to pay. And the public seems, whether the costs are hidden or not, despite the threats, there's a willingness to pay at the expense of higher education, at the expense of healthcare, the expense of housing. And I think there's a great deal of work to be done educating people on that. One other thing I think it's important for us to remember, so the war on drugs is changing for the reasons that Jelani said, for both good and bad reasons. But in its wake, most of the empirical research now about incarceration suggests that it's not being driven any longer by the war on drugs, and maybe hasn't been for perhaps the last 7 or 8 years. What's driving it is very, very long sentences that are passed by legislators that are just simply piling on every year with an increment, a little bump each year in the sentence lengths. And they're pretty much for violent offenses. So there's another dynamic that's been launched. And that, together with pretty much the death of parole, there's really not much parole being granted anywhere. Where it is, it's terribly racially biased, as in New York State. So there's work to be done on understanding that we're now in a different era of incarceration, and the pressure points are going to be quite different.
In this administration, with all the added factors that we're looking at, an immigration battle looming, and certainly the quote unquote, I don't know what you want to call it, but the holding cells that people are placed in detention, depending on where you sit. You call it a prison, you may not call it a prison. But looking ahead over the next 4 years, where are we going? What will we be doing? And how effective can some of the things that you just proposed be, or will be?
Well, what I would say is I think we have to be very, very vigilant that there's not a new war on drugs emerging, not on drugs in this case, but war on immigrants. And that, because what I saw, and I was teaching my class the other day, is the ways in which particular cases of mothers using crack were being used to sort of demonize mothers who were poor, who might have then subsequently ended up losing their children or going to prison. But the same thing is happening with the recent effort to identify immigrants who are undocumented and have committed crimes every week. So it's so this is, again, it's identifying individual cases and using them to push policy and to fill detention centers. And we don't want to make the mistakes that we can very easily identify now that were made in the 80s and 90s. Again, we want to start to say it's not okay to make policies based on single cases, whether they're egregious or not.
And I think, to your point, I think one of the things that's most frightening now is in the 80s and 90s, people made bad decisions, but they made bad decisions in the midst of calamity. We're saying that we have this drug crisis, these things are happening, and they weren't sure. They're kind of scrambling for the thing to do. What frightens me, terrifies me about the current climate is that the demagogic president is able to manufacture fear. So there's an idea that we are besieged by crime, statistics be damned, that we are imperiled by particularly undocumented crime. Again, statistics be damned.
Well, you flipped the statistics just yesterday.
What do you mean?
Yesterday, it was incredible. He said the murder rate is the highest it's been in 47 years. He actually had it completely wrong.
Right.
It's the lowest it's been in 47 years.
Right.
We have to wonder.
But I think it's like the kind of limbic kind of reaction that he is operating on, and so it really doesn't matter. If you were to ask people what the unemployment rate is, they would almost certainly, his group, they would almost certainly think that it was higher than when Obama first took office. And so, absent a drug crisis of the proportions of crack in the 80s and 90s, we could still see a return to the same sort of mentality that facilitated that kind of behavior.
During the decade, maybe from the early 2000s to the early part of this decade, the crime rates were going down, and in most elections, it just wasn't even an issue on for either local or federal elections. All of a sudden now it's an issue, and all of a sudden with the crime rates really going down, except in a handful of places like Chicago, with the crime rates going down, there's still this gap, this black-white gap, in perceived fear of crime, and the fear of crime has gone just completely outpaced the realities of crime. And that fear is a very scary sign on the horizon, because it's easy to cash that in electorally for votes by bumping up, for example, sentence lengths. And we've seen that cycle happen repeatedly.
Well, I think it's an equation of domestic crime and terrorism. I mean, they're sort of
Equation,
they're
yeah.
exactly. We want to throw the questions out to the audience, or rather have you throw the questions back at the panel. Do we have any questions from the audience? Come on, I know some people have some great questions. We'd like to, if you could just find a mic, which is right over here, and we'd like to take 2 or 3 questions at a time, so step right up.
Hi, I'm Gabrielle. I'm a medical student. So one thing I was curious about is if any of you could speak to the overlap with the deinstitutionalization movement of a large portion of the psychiatric facilities in the U.S. that happened sort of around the same time as the culture shift post-civil rights and the impact that that's had on incarceration rates.
You want to gather questions? Or you want to take?
Let's, since we only have 2, let's take it.
So it's clear that the prisons and especially jails are the new psychiatric hospitals. It's a real problem that with deinstitutionalization, that there was no sort of services, no support put in place, that in the 70s and 80s. I mean, one of the things that you'll see if you go into the prisons today is that the lineup for psychiatric medication is like one of the longest lines that you'll see. And so prisons and jails aren't equipped to support people with psychiatric illness. And certainly they're not ready to come home, and you get an awful lot of people ending up going back because of untreated illness. There is another problem that sort of, in a sense, is recapitulating that problem, is that people are coming home from prison, especially where they've served very long sentences and been disrupted from their communities, and we're not ready to support them. We're not providing housing, we're not providing jobs, and we're not providing education and all the other kind of things that integrate people into communities. So if you're talking about something that we can do to support people who've gotten involved with the criminal justice system, we can advocate for that.
This is one really quick addition to that point, is that I spent 10 months in 2015 and 2016 in Newark, following police for a Frontline documentary that I was part of. And it happens on every level, not just the incarceration level. So many of these instances we find of police shootings are instances where police are in fact responding to someone who is in crisis. And the police will tell you they are not equipped. They are there to handle law enforcement. They are not trained, and they are not equipped to deal with mental health issues. And that's why we so frequently see it culminate in use of fatal use of force.
But there's also a resistance by the police to, when offered to the support of a mental health unit, the EDP unit, as they say in the NYPD. They refuse it. They simply feel that the security concerns of a particular situation with a volatile individual who might be having some kind of an acute episode are more important than any other form of intervention. And there's lots of ways, there's lots of video, it's interesting video about people pursuing alternate ways in police departments of dealing with emotionally disturbed persons. But there seems to be some resistance to that technology, and that's an important cultural idea about policing.
Okay, we're gonna take 1, 2, 3 questions, and then we'll have 1, 2, 3 answers. Starting
Okay, so this question is, what context? First, in regards to what you said about the film is very heavy.
You said
I am.
Isaac,
Can you hear me?
hold it up.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry. I'm
Can't
sorry.
hear you.
Okay, so my name is Isaac. Loud. My name is Isaac Scott. I work and study under Professor Downey. I also served 9 years in prison in New York State. So this video watching is very different for me than most people in this audience. It actually is very heavy. You know, I never actually watched it all the way through. I can only watch about half and then watch another half because it's very heavy, right? So the question that I have was in regards to one of the things that were mentioned as a collateral consequence, which is the inability to get employment after you come home from prison with a felony conviction. So about 2 years ago, I think we're at, they actually banned the felony question from the employment application. And this was a movement that was heavily, this was heavily driven, and this is the answer. They'll stop discriminating against us if they remove that question, right? So now what we're seeing, as of late, a few studies have come out that have shown that there are severe adverse effects to banning this question from applications because in a form of retaliation, employers are now using methods of statistical discrimination to kind of vet and sift out who they may believe is formerly incarcerated based on characteristics that are commonly associated with people who have a criminal conviction, skin color, gaps in employment. So my question to you all, and not to Professor Downey because we go through this all day, but to Mr. Fagan and Mr. Cobb, I guess I just wanted to know what would next steps be? How do we prevent this or not prevent it? If we can't prevent it, what do we do next to prevent? Because what's happening is now the overall, and I'm sorry if I'm taking long, but this is very important. The overall, employment rates for black men are now decreasing.
Right.
So this is very serious. So this is why I asked that question.
And so we're going to have a second question.
Are you taking the question right away now? Mm-hmm. All right, yeah. My name is Chris. I'm a part of the Directly Impacted group here on campus. It's a formerly incarcerated staff, students, and faculty. So my question has to do with kind of like Michelle Alexander's theory of colorblindness in society and how it can be problematic. And a Diva Pager's study that found that in Milwaukee, a white man with a record is more likely to get a job than a black man without a record. And my question is, as he was saying about like ban the box, which sometimes has only helped white people with records, in this era of colorblindness, how can we set forth reforms and policies that cut through that colorblindness and actually help the people that it's needed to help instead of just benefiting white people who've been incarcerated?
Let's tackle both of those questions. They're inextricably linked.
There's a method of testing for discrimination that is it's a very strong method, but to mount it on a big scale is difficult to do. The method's very simple. They send in testers to a prospective employer, one black, one white, and they have identical resumes. And they alternate in this experiment where first the black man will go in, then the white man, and then they'll switch it, and the white man will go in first, then the black man. What happens inevitably is that the black person's told, there is no, I'm sorry, I can't, you're not qualified for the job. And the white guy with the identical resume is told, well, you have a job. And so this employer then is found guilty of violating discrimination laws, both state laws and federal laws. That's an important thing to do. And it identifies the individual employer or maybe a small group of employers who are discriminating. But to take that up to scale and make that pattern known so that it becomes, I suppose, a social norm and socially rejected takes a great deal of effort in organizing. I think one of the organizing things that can be done is to publicize and maybe even in an act of public shaming employers who actually engage in those practices. But it is a really hard thing because, as the first questioner said, people will just simply make an assumption. If you are a black person, they're going to say you're a criminal because we think all the criminals are black people.
So, Jelani, how do you game the system for the person who wants to do the right thing, who wants to get a job, who wants to be a productive citizen?
I think that, there are a couple things. One is that this is the nature of this issue. So when we look at this, it's not simply emancipation leads to incarceration. It's a whole string of things that happen since then. We can even talk about the electoral representation that white Southerners got, the additional representation in the House of Representatives they got by counting the bodies of 3/5 of the enslaved population. And now when we see in the census that people are being counted in the places where they are incarcerated, not in the largely black and brown communities they come from, being counted in the largely rural white communities where they are incarcerated, which generates additional revenue, additional representation, additional political strength for these places. It's the same sort of dynamic. It's not simply this evolution from ban the box to kind of statistical modes of discrimination. But I think that the idea of kind of naming and shaming people is important. I think we also have to have, on the other side of it, something that is very difficult to get political support for, or social support for, that we have to actively say that we are encouraging people, whether it be through tax credits or however it looks, to say, well, yes, this person is formally incarcerated and we want you to hire them. Because we are interested in, one, just on the fiscal responsibility part of it, not creating a permanently unemployable class of citizens.
But what can he do? I mean, I think that, where do you go?
He has a job.
Okay, so isn't that the question you're asking? What can
No, he has a
in
job.
No, but I mean, not just you, but your friends. I mean, the individual
Use your
right here
mic.
and now.
Use your mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was loud enough. But
I think Mr. Cobb got as close as we can get to a solution today.
okay, all right. Well, then let's go to the next question.
That's what I always aim for.
Just one last thought on this. There's some really interesting stories of micro-investment strategies to support businesses that start in neighborhoods that otherwise have been kind of socially redlined by high incarceration rates. And those micro-investment strategies actually can pay off. But it takes a little bit of coordination of policy to make sure that those investment strategies are actually managed in a way that they actually do the most good. And that they're sustainable over time, not just for the startup phase, but so that a business can endure over time.
Good evening. My name is Bruce Clifton. You posed a question was posed about how this film could be shown to wider audiences. I don't know if this has been, if anybody has looked at this yet, but in urban areas, I think a good suggestion would be to show them in churches. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
All right.
I think there's one other thing, just as a kind of final point about the incarceration and the unemployment aspect that comes after it. When I was talking with a group of, at a university, it was mostly young white students, and I was talking about the issue of incarceration, and I was in a rural place, and I was thinking that people were thinking that this is a kind of urban black and brown problem. And I was trying to figure out the way to get across to them the way that this is not simply a matter of, oh, you're a terrible person, we should be afraid of you. And the analogy that I came up with was credit. So when we had the housing crisis in 08, 09, and people were stuck in these homes that they had paid the mortgage for, they had been responsible homeowners, but then their neighborhood home values tanked. And you found people having to leave their homes, whether, for all the things that happened. You wound up with lots of people who had bad credit, but it said more about the context in which you lived than about your individual responsibility or trustworthiness. And so when we look at people who have felony records now, it is like credit. It's like credit in 2009, 2010. It does not tell you a great deal about that person, but it tells you a good deal about the social context in which that person has lived. And so gradually, I know everyone's mad at Uber now, but I felt a little bit conflicted when everything happened with Uber because they have a program in which they have been hiring people, formerly incarcerated people, and because the tech industry is just, they have an abundance of data, they can actually look and say, well, these people who were locked out of the employment market perform identically to people who have not had criminal records. And they're looking at the customer ratings, they're looking at how fast they drive, how safely they drive, how many accidents they get into, all of this data. And it points to saying that these people are virtually identical to this other group of people. So what we're measuring is not specifically personality traits or behaviors, but we're measuring more our social attitudes and public policies and things that we've been willing to tolerate in communities of color, and what the end result of them has been in terms of the locking people out of employment unjustly.
Yeah, data matters, facts matter, truth matters, really does. And so, and by gosh darn it, you know, you can sometimes have all your facts right and not tell the truth. Think about that. There was just one thing I wanted to point out through like my coverage of many different communities across this country, and I tell people this all the time, that it has been my experience that Black and brown people and what happens to them, by and large, if it is happening to them at some point in time, we are the canaries in the coal mine. Believe it will happen to the mainstream of this nation. It will happen to everyone sooner or later. And so that, you know, to be a responsible society, to be a benevolent society, to be a society that understands that, you know, you want what is best for your neighbor, but you also want what is best for you, is to be cognizant of what is happening to the other. And that's just my 2 cents. Just, it is happening to white people in Iowa and Nebraska. They are being stopped because some of those young white males who are from the wrong side of the tracks are identified as being from the wrong side of the tracks in those communities where there are no people who look different. You know, they find other ways to peg them. So don't believe, I mean, it's happening to Black and brown people in a different way in urban communities, but it's happening to folks who, you know, are pink and beige too.
No, I think that what you've said is so important, because hypercriminalization means that it's going to affect everybody. And if that's the way we're going to solve problems in society, we're going to just be punishing and not solving anything.
The worst thing, in my opinion, is the only time I'm going to give my opinion,
Go
is Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, when we separated on and legalized, you know, segregation.
Yeah.
Because society, we're a whole country. You can't separate a whole country and think that you're all going to get to the end game, the end zone, the goal line. Together, it's not going to happen. So that was me, Michelle Miller, not the journalist. And I just had to give it there. I know, I'm sorry, I hate preaching. I was an instructor at a college, and I love that job. I really did.
You got a captive
So yeah,
audience,
right. So thank you all.
Thank you.
I really appreciate Jeff. I learned a lot from him in the green room. Geraldine and Jelani, amazing panelists. Please come up and interrogate them.
Interrogate's not the right word tonight.
Thank you.